I think it's an evolutionary adaptation that allows, in times of stress or famine or some emotional stress, to just switch the genes on or off. The biggest study done to date clearly showed a link between nutritional eating habits, fiber, and health, and showed that these clusters, that measures of gut health, which is then we used something called diversity. The more diverse the species, the healthier you were, and the less likely you were to be obese or have diabetes. It's not about that one thing that you do or you don't do. It's about the holistic view of that. What can you get on your plate? That was really epiphany, because I found that identical twins had very different. Many of the diseases we thought were purely due to aging, for example, ended up having a big genetic component, and many things that we thought were genetic ended up not being particularly genetic. So we found that back pain was 3 times more genetic than breast cancer.
The state of science with respect to what we understood about genetics in 1992 is very different than it is today.
Yeah, it's hard to believe how much our opinions have changed, and how, the scientists and doctors of the time have had these fixed views about everything was degenerative. It was just everything was wear and tear, and your body just wore out. And that was a common thing for anything to do with aging. And the idea there were these big differences between people really wasn't really considered. So it was really quite exciting to be able to write these pivotal papers to disprove a lot of, clinical nonsense that had been talked about. And I was telling everyone everything's genetic. It turns out that you name any disease, 50% roughly is genetic. And that got a bit dull. For me, I started looking more closely at why identical twins, who were basic genetic clones and lived the first 18 years of their life completely together, ended up often dying of different diseases. So the aging process was different. There was no real genetic base of longevity. It was very small. One would die of cancer, the other one wouldn't. One would get autoimmune disease, the other one wouldn't. One would be depressed, one wouldn't. So I was slightly intrigued why we were seeing this when, all the previous stuff was showing it seemed to be genetic, and yet the identical twins, which is this perfect model of these, it's like all of us have this shadow person that can be living in a different environment to us. What happens to them? It's like your own little controlled study. And so I was fascinated by this, and I then determined to try and look and see what were those factors. Was it gene mutations that were different between them? Turned out that wasn't the case. I looked at something called epigenetics, which is where you can switch genes on and off with chemical signals. Did that for a few years. Only small differences that couldn't really explain these big effects. And it was about just over 11 years ago that I came across the microbiome and said, let's test this in twins. And that was really epiphany, because I found that identical twins had very different microbes. And it was the first time in 20 odd years of studying them that I'd found something really different in identical twins. And suddenly I said, wow, that is really cool, because why should they be different? And yet if they are different, that could explain why we all get different diseases slightly what we thought was randomly, because of this whole new organ in our bodies that is behaving very differently in all of us, and essentially producing lots of different chemicals. We'd assumed everyone behaves the same. Once that food goes into you, it's going to behave the same way in everybody. And suddenly knowing that even in identical twins, they only share maybe a quarter of their microbes, means that in response to the same food, they're all going to respond very differently. I think it's an evolutionary adaptation that allows, in times of stress or famine or some emotional stress, to just switch the genes on or off in a way that takes you on a different path to some extent. And general belief is that it takes so long to change your genes normally that your whole family would have been wiped out by that time you'd made that switch. But if this allows you to, there's a temperature change, so allows you to switch so you gain more weight, or just the fact that your family might all be switching their genes so that they end up more different, so they're not all going to be wiped out by the same environmental stress or infective agent, makes some sort of sense. But it just lasts for a couple of generations and then fizzles out. The biggest study done to date clearly showed a link between nutritional eating habits, fiber, and health, and showed that these clusters, that measures of gut health, which is then we used something called diversity. The more diverse the species, the healthier you were, and the less likely you were to be obese or have diabetes. And so this was common to the the British and the American populations, American populations tend to still be, they were slightly heavier, slightly less diverse microbes compared to the British. But the key bit of that paper was the one that found that 30 plants a week was the sweet spot for maximum diversity. That study still hasn't sort of been bettered many years later, and it's been a bit of a mantra for me in the books that I write for the public about trying to educate people about what to eat. Mm-hmm. And I think what was really important about the study is that it showed as long as you ate 30 types of plant, and that's including nuts and seeds and to some extent herb mixes and spices, it didn't matter whether you had a little bit of meat, a little bit of fish, you were vegan, vegetarian, whatever, your gut health was still optimal. And I think that still resonates with me, that it's not about, that one thing that you do or you don't do. It's about the holistic view of that. What can you get on your plate? And clearly, if you've got a big, if 3/4 of it's filled with a giant steak, there's not much room for your plants.
Right. And so the top level rule just being diversity of plant life in your diet on the most consistent basis possible is producing the diversity in that gut microbiome ecology that is going to be, the sort of front lines of keeping you healthy.
Sugar or triglycerides are part of normal physiology. So, our body's designed to do that way. But if there's too many of them and the spikes are too prolonged, you either get a buildup of, so the sugar spikes will create rise in insulin, which can start getting insulin resistance, and long term you might end up more likely to get diabetes, pushing you towards pre-diabetes, etc. And that build-up in triglycerides are particularly related to inflammation. You get inflammation in the blood vessels. Over time, that stress builds up, and again, heart disease and other metabolic problems. So the idea is that if you can calm that down, so you're not having as many of those spikes in the day, then your inflammation levels are lower, and we've shown that they are related to blood inflammation markers. You will reduce your risk of many common chronic diseases, most of which are related to some extent to what we call chronic inflammation, this sort of low-level stress in the body. And other studies have shown that people who have prone to these sugar spikes end up long-term with more diabetes and heart disease. So there are sort of links you can make epidemiologically. We also know that some of these big spikes, we showed there's something called a sugar dip. So one in 3 men, 1 in 3 women, 1 in 4 men, after a carby, say breakfast or lunch, 3 hours later will have a dip below baseline. And you say, well, okay, that's not something to worry about. But we followed a large number of these people, and it turns out they report being more tired. They don't know what their result, they were blind to their result. They were more tired, they were more hungry, and they overate by about 300 calories that day. So these sugar dips, which you get from highly refined foods and carbs, are actually making you overeat as well. So they, over time, will make you gain much more weight than someone who's not having these dips. So some people are even more susceptible than others.